back to the library. You know, it's been a long time since we have had a book discussion in the library, and I think it's about time. I hope that it will meet our expectations of more of that comfortable, cozy feeling of being able to feel not as sterile. And I know that I was a teacher, Lois was a teacher, professor. So, you know, it's just, you know, there's something nice about some lounge chairs, some padded cushions that make for maybe a little bit more friendly, user-friendly for a discussion of books. My name is Marcia Scholes. I have met most of you, but if you're not familiar, I am the chairman and have been since last July of the Friends of the Library. I will be transitioning out of that role this coming July as our vice chair will move up, and I will stay on the board another year. So if you have any questions, any suggestions, you'd like to get involved with the Friends of the Library, I'd be more than happy to visit with you after this. One of the things that, for those of you who haven't been here before, one of the reasons why we're excited to be back here is that for obvious reasons, COVID, we continued our book discussions, but they were on Zoom. And while it was a success, it was also a little bit, you know, cold. It's hard to share books and our feelings over Zoom, I think. So we're anxious to be back here. We're trying something new today. We decided that one of the things that we have noticed here at Rosen is anytime there are drinks, adult beverages involved, that people even appreciate it more. That's not to say that we're using your dues, however, for financing your thirst. Instead, what we're asking is that you would do a small donation to the Friends of the Library. Pour yourself a glass of wine. There's some snacks up there. If you decide to imbibe or want to, please do it before the gentleman starts speaking in just a minute. And then afterwards, we would like to certainly have you all stick around, and we'll just visit and top off those bottles. So you can also get your drinks then. But this is just a test. If you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, let me know. And I will pass that on to the book discussion committee. But we're giving it a try this year, this time. Two more announcements, and then I'm going to let the gentleman take over. But for those of you who have never attended a book review before, for a book discussion here with Friends of the Library, we do these 4 times a year. Our year goes from July to July. So this is supposed to be the, now I'm getting myself, no, I'm sorry. The book discussions go from January to December. FOL goes from July to July. So we appreciate you, if you're not a member, joining. We are in our membership. I was listening to NPR this morning, so you know, they're on a membership campaign. I feel like I'm just repeating what they're saying, but we are in our membership period right now, and it will go until the end of June. And so it's $10 a person. That money goes towards providing whatever the library needs. We have received so many donations this year for books. We are, in fact, I put in an order this morning for additional titles that will be coming in. Probably somewhere around 50 more books will be coming in. The newest books, for those of you who haven't ventured in here lately, are going to be found in that short bookcase that faces the checkout. They are there for a certain amount of time until we order new books, and then we integrate those into our other shelves and we replace them with more books that we're buying. So keep an eye there for the latest and greatest, but donated books get immediately put into our on our shelves. And so we've got so many new books like that. I think you're going to love all of them. Okay, so just a plug, in July 14th, you might want to have it on your calendar, we will have our annual meeting. That will be over in the clubhouse unless something changes. If it does, we'll let you know. But right now, it's scheduled because we anticipate typically more people. And it'll start getting a little hot and crowded in here. It will be followed by a book discussion that was supposed to have been this past February. It was All Quiet on the Western Front. The presenters will be Mike Hall, General Hall, who is certainly an expert when it comes to the military. He knows, I did give a title. And LaDonna Wamachel will be the other presenter. They didn't do it in February because if you remember, there was an uptick of COVID about that time, and we thought it wasn't cautious of us to have a meeting of this type. But it will be immediately following the annual meeting, and that will come to you by information in the HOA as well as GroupWorks. The book that will be the fourth book of this year. So today's the second book, but the first one. The second one now will be what was supposed to be the first one. All Quiet on the Western Front in July. In September, I think. Gosh, I'm throwing a blank here.
I think
it's got to be September. I believe it's September.
September 15th.
Thank you. In September will be Empire of the Summer Moon. It's a book about Quanah Parker, the last big chieftain of the Comanches, and it's a lot of history that if any of you have lived here in this North Texas area for long, you'll recognize places and names and all sorts of things. Fort Worth, I mean, not the name Fort Worth, but the people and places in that area. And then the last one, and it was just returned about 5 minutes ago, that's why I have it in my hands, because I thought I'll just tout this book, is going to be in November, and it is The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. Amor Towles wrote A Gentleman in Moscow. We did that one on Zoom, I believe, 2 years ago during COVID. It was an excellent book. So this will be the fourth one. It will be in November. I'm going to put it on the shelf. I'll hand it to Gary to put on top of our shelf. And the first person who wants to check it out as you leave today can take it. And all we ask is, especially these books that we are trying to keep circulating, check it out, but try to get it back in a very short amount of time, not 2 days, that was a big book, but short enough so that many people, we bought 3 copies of it, but they tend to stay out sometimes a little longer than they should. Okay, any questions for me before I sit down and enjoy? Yes.
Do you coordinate your buying of books at all with the Military History Reading Book Club?
No, they haven't.
Okay, well, they're going to be reading by September O'Reilly's new book, Killing the Killers, which is about killing, Osama bin Laden. Thank you.
Okay.
And I just wondered if, I know you've had other O'Reilly books over here. And
Right.
That hasn't come, that's just now coming out.
Oh, it is just now coming out?
Yeah.
No. Remember, everything's by donation here except for the books that we raised money in a special first time ever campaign this past fall to buy books, and we put book plates in those books in honor of the people who donated them, who they were wanting to remember or to honor in whatever way. And they, if they wanted a special book, we tried to fulfill those requests. After that, most of the people told us that they would prefer that we used ours. And so we have several librarians on our selection committee, and they have met several times and put their heads together and came up with some excellent titles, and then I just get to write the check because it's coming from your money. But it came specifically donated for books. Now, the Friends of the Library just passed, I'm talking longer than I expected to. They just passed another, last month, that going forward, we are going to quarterly give money to the library board to purchase things other than books. So for those of you who may be puzzle lovers, and we have a lot of them here in the library, we are going to be using that money, I think they are going to be using, I should say, that money for large piece puzzles and something else.
100 piece.
And 100-piece puzzles. Right. So anyhow, the money is not going to wine and snacks. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. If you probably know, but our book today is The Tragedy of Puddin'head Wilson. Some of you may have read it in high school. Some of you may not have read it at all. Some of you have read it, like myself, just recently, just to hear these gentlemen. We have Louis Toland, who is on the book discussion committee this year, and Joe Bono, who has been a presenter before, not on the committee at this time, although he never knows when we may snag him on the committee. But they are both here. Louis, I believe, will probably give you his own credentials, but he is an expert when it comes to Mark Twain. And Louis is like I mentioned before, a former presenter. He's going to be giving, I believe, the background of Mark Twain.
That's me.
Joe.
Oh, I'm sorry, I looked right at you and said Joe. And that's, I know who Louis and Joe are, I'm sorry.
He's the one that understands the book.
He understands the book, this guy understands the man. Okay, so with no further ado, I promise I'm going to sit down. Thank you very much for coming today and enjoy the review.
Can you hear me? Okay.
No,
No? Not enough?
just, you almost have to put it right up to your mouth.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? All right. And I can't see. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. And like me, a lot of you probably know Mark Twain from high school, and not much about him. You know Tom Sawyer, you know Huck Finn, at least the names anyway. Maybe you even read the books. But you never learn too much about Mark Twain the man or his career unless you have a particular interest and learn about him later on, as Louis did. So we're going to start with a little bit of an overview of Mark Twain, the person, and I've interspersed in these slides some of these clips that Mark Twain is sort of famous for, or known for. Actually, he's famous for quite a few of them, but just to keep you all awake, I thought I'd throw that in. The first one is the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. That's a fairly well-known saying. I don't think I could have told you Mark Twain was the source of it, but we all know that one. Mark Twain, of course, was not Mark Twain when he was born. He was Samuel Langhorne Clemens. He was born in 1835 in Missouri, and as a little boy, his family moved to Hannibal, Missouri. And he had a difficult childhood for a number of reasons. I think he was one of 6 children, 6 I think. 2 of them and his father had died by the time Samuel was 12 years old. And that made life harder than it was before. Debts forced the family to sell land and possessions and take in boarders. In Hannibal, Samuel was exposed to slavery's ways and slavery's evils, and also Hannibal's violence. Hannibal was more or less a frontier town in 1835. It was sort of on the western edge of the Midwest that had been quasi-settled by then. And things were pretty raucous and wild in Hannibal compared to what we know and love. After his father died, he had to leave school and he worked as a printer's apprentice at 13 years old. And that just might be Mark Twain at 13 years old or thereabouts. I hope that's a hat on his head and not the rest of his hair. But you can't tell from the picture for sure, but I'm guessing it's a hat. Anyway, that was him as a teenager, it looks like. Maybe this was his first picture as working at the print shop. At 16, he began working for his older brother, Orion. His older brother was named Orion, like the constellation. And he published a newspaper, Orion did. So he worked for Orion. At 17, Samuel began contributing sketches and articles to the paper as his love of expression on paper and with the English language started to come out. He left the paper and he left Hannibal in 1853, which would make him about 18. And he worked at many jobs in many places for the next 20 years of his life. The second picture is probably Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens in his 20s, I'd say. He's got that bushy, big head of hair, curly. He's got the bushy mustache, but they're not white. They're dark. Young man, but if you look at him, he looks like the same Mark Twain that we've seen in pictures as an older gentleman, I think. In 1857, 4 years after leaving Hannibal. Now, Mark Twain was a go-getter. He was not a person, he was not a wallflower. He obviously knew there was a world out there, and he wanted to take part in it. He wanted to advance himself. He wanted to be a success. He wanted to make money. He was probably a type A personality, if you get my meaning. But anyway, by 1857, he was on his way on a steamboat to New Orleans, which was a stopping point after which he could go on to South America. And in South America, he intended to make his fortune and make a splash in the world. But he saw an opportunity and an interest in himself while he was on the steamboat on the Mississippi on the way to New Orleans. And he said, gee, this might be a good opportunity for me to learn something and get a good job here. So he persuaded the riverboat captain of the boat to take him on as an apprentice. Obviously, he was a pretty good salesman with regard to himself. And that happened. And he stayed on the boat, didn't go on to South America, became an apprentice, and eventually in 1859, 2 years later, he got his riverboat pilot's license. This was a pretty good job. He, of course, was in charge, and it took a lot of knowledge of the river to qualify as a riverboat pilot and captain. It was a prestige job. He liked that. He enjoyed the next 2 years on the river. Here's another one of his quips. A clear conscience is the sure sign of a bad memory. We can all relate to that, I think. All right, in 1861, of course, the Civil War commenced, and that ruined life on the river. commercial river traffic for quite a while kind of stopped, and military river traffic sort of took over what was going on the river. So went his nice job. He volunteered for the Confederate Army, the local army in Missouri, militia. Even though his family had Union leanings, he, for whatever reason, decided he was going to be a Confederate. But it didn't last long, and he decided maybe he didn't like the Army, maybe he didn't like getting shot at. I'm not sure how much action he saw, but he disliked it, and he decided to join his brother Orion, it's the same Orion, but he was now in the Nevada territory out west, seeking his fortune and fame. So Samuel went to Nevada instead of re-enlisting in the Confederate Army, and joined them in the wild Nevada territory in the midst of a mining boom that was going on out there, probably silver mining. Among various pursuits when he was out in Nevada, he continued writing articles and became a newspaper reporter. During this period, he took on the famous pen name of Mark Twain. Now, where does that come from? Mark Twain was an expression used on the riverboat by the crew that were taking soundings of the depth of the water. The riverboat required about 12 feet of water in order to navigate the Mississippi in those days safely. And when they, with their soundings, found that the depth was at least 12 feet, which is 2 fathoms, they would yell out to the officers, "Mark Twain." That means we've got 12 feet of water under us. Well, Mark Twain kind of liked that, and probably, as an homage to his riverboat career, he decided he would be Mark Twain rather than Samuel Langhorne Clemens. He was a frisky sort of a guy, as I mentioned. After overstaying his welcome in Nevada, after a couple of years, and he was the kind of guy that maybe spoke his mind, wasn't crazy about rules, did his own thing. Not everybody he dealt with was his friend or liked him. And so, to make that long story short, in '64 he moved to San Francisco, back to civilization of sorts. He continued as a reporter while also submitting articles for other publications, establishing his literary credentials, and just as an interesting point, he managed to get a job there in San Francisco, or an assignment to do an article about Hawaii, at the time called the Sandwich Islands. You may know that was Hawaii before it was Hawaii. And he actually went to Hawaii on a boat, a ship, and he spent some time there exploring and learning about the folks that lived there, and doing articles on Hawaii. Okay, in 1867 he relocated to New York City. Soon he bought a house in Connecticut that strained his finances. Now, why did he do that? Why did he go to Connecticut? Well, Mark Twain's the go-getter was aspiring to be a famous or a renowned author, somebody who was appreciated as an accomplished literary person. And in the Northeast in those days, the more well-known, accomplished authors kind of gathered to live in Connecticut, a few hours from New York City. So he thought he would insinuate himself into the group by moving to Connecticut and buying a nice house, which he did. But it did strain his finances, and he had strained finances for a while, on and off in his life, even though he made a lot of money. By the way, in 1870, he got married to Olivia, who was his wife for the rest of his life, and they had 3 daughters. Okay, another quip, this one you probably heard. It's better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than open it and remove all doubt. Interestingly, I first heard that from my mom, who occasionally would point that out to myself and my two younger brothers. I don't know if she knew Mark Twain was the origin of that quip. I don't think I could have told you it was Mark Twain, but Mark Twain's responsible for a lot of things like that. Now to move on quickly, just in outline form, his writing career, once he got established, and he did get established by that point, major works by Mark Twain, which you may or may not recognize the titles of, are The Gilded Age, which was his first one. These are novels, you know. 1873, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which you've all maybe read and certainly have heard of. 1876, The Prince and the Pauper. 81, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which didn't come right after Tom Sawyer. In fact, it came 9 years after The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, maybe you saw the movie. 1889, and then Puddin'head Wilson was his last novel, last published novel, and it wasn't published till 1894. So it was a while before Puddin'head Wilson came along. All right. The trouble is not in dying for a friend, but in finding a friend worth dying for. Mark Twain was a bit of a cynic as well. Travel and memoirs he also published and was successful with The Innocents Abroad in 69, Roughing It in 72, Life on the Mississippi, which was an accounting of his growing up on the Mississippi and then his years on the riverboat as a riverboat pilot. That was pretty popular. And then his autobiography, I think a recent publishing of his autobiography came out in 2010 and 2015, but he dictated his autobiography to an associate beginning 2 or 3 years before he died in 1910. And in various pieces and parts, it started showing up in periodicals beginning in 1912, 2 years after he died. And it just sold a lot of books, too. His career declined, it's interesting to note, in terms of his popularity among the reading public. His career declined because he got more cynical and took to criticizing society and its inconsistencies and he stopped prioritizing entertaining the reader and started to emphasize making his points, however difficult they might make in the reading society, or difficult they might be to be accepted. He started offending people rather than entertaining them. So his books at the end of his writing career didn't sell nearly as well as early on because he became a bit of a crusader rather than an entertainer in his books. Money Made and Lost, he had a big failure of financial fortune in supporting the development of the page typesetter. He was a big believer, as you might imagine, in the printing press. Page typesetter was an early attempt at a mechanical typesetter, which somebody at a keyboard would operate, which would set the type semi-automatically, which was then going to be used in the printing press to print pages of text. It didn't work. It was too complex. They couldn't get it to work reliably. It didn't sell. He put a lot of money in it, and it bankrupted him the first time. Another way he lost a lot of money that he made, and he did make a lot of money, was in failed publishing ventures. He bought magazines, he bought a newspaper. None of them turned out very well financially, and he lost a lot of money that way too. Okay, the last topic is part of his background, which some of you may be aware of. His intersection with President Grant, U.S. Grant. They became acquainted when Grant was president and developed a bit of a friendship. Much later on, an aging, poor, and terminally ill Grant agreed to write his autobiography, which he'd never wanted to do, to make some money to leave to his wife, because he knew he was going to die soon. Twain learned of the terms he agreed to and felt Grant and the book were being undervalued by a lot. So he convinced, Twain did, convinced Grant to allow him to publish the book and market the book himself. And that was a home run. It was a bestseller, made a lot of money, which supported Mrs. Grant, who was widowed soon after the book was published, and made a good deal of money for Mark Twain, too. And another cynical comment by Mr. Twain: we have the best government that money can buy. I didn't mean that as a compliment. And some things don't change. And there you have it. We now will go to the book, the reason we're all here. And our Mark Twain scholar and expert, Louis Tolan, don't be nervous now, don't push. He's going to lead that part of the discussion.
Publish anything under Samuel Clemens?
Well, not major books, but yes, he was still operating as Samuel Clemens, but he wasn't famous yet. I don't think. He never became famous as Samuel Clemens. Oh, yeah.
Well, how do you do? I hope this works out all right. This is when I usually like to take my nap. Some of you are enjoying some wine, so it could be rather quiet here shortly. As far as this business of being an expert, by luck or the grace of God, my dad grew up in West Central Illinois between Springfield and Quincy. So two of his and my boyhood heroes were Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain. Had the privilege of going through Lincoln's house and grounds in Springfield. I highly commend him. And Mother drove me over to see the little house in Hannibal, where Twain grew up, and the fence next to it allegedly is where Tom Sawyer persuaded his friends to pay it for it. And there's also Injun Joe's Cave out there. As far as background, I didn't particularly want to go to college, but the other option at the time was Vietnam, and that made college look a lot more attractive. I wanted to go sometime, not right away, but Vietnam, I think you would do right away. Got a degree in business because it was easy. Since then, business majors have to study calculus, and I got tangled up in Algebra 1. So I got a business degree at the right time. Then took a Master of Arts in was titled Religion, basically biblical studies and church history. And then he moved around. I got my PhD in English at the University of Kansas. I don't particularly recommend the school now, but I'm still fond of the basketball team, which has gone pretty well recently. So that's a little background now. At Kansas, on the comprehensive exams, we had to pick a major author. And I liked Twain, so I went in that direction. And had to read most of the books that he wrote, and a lot of criticism about him. And then I had the privilege of sitting down for 3 hours and writing a written exam, anything the professors wanted to ask me about Mark Twain. So I did learn quite a bit about him. I still enjoy him. As far as being an expert, I try to remember that the definition of an expert is that X is a mathematical symbol for the unknown, a spurt is a drip under pressure. So I guess I'm an unknown drip under pressure. Have most of you read the novel?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
Well, I'm kind of torn. Majority have read it, but for those that haven't, I could do a quick plot summary. Do you have pleasure in that matter? What is it?
Plot summary.
This is not the best plotted of all novels. David Wilson arrives in Dawson's Landing in 1830 and jokes about a barking dog. Said, "I sure wished I owned half of that dog." "Why? What would you do with it?" "I'd kill my half." Now, oddly, that is exactly the sort of coarse humor that the locals would have indulged in. The problem was this outsider was trying to be a local. So they called him a Puddin'head, unfairly. And that's the origin of his name, Puddin'head. It's David Wilson. Oddly, he stays around town for two decades, doing odd jobs, bookkeeping, surveying, just any number of things except being a lawyer. Now that strains credulity a little bit. Why would anyone stick around for 2 decades? But he does. And his only really close friend is Judge Percy Driscoll, the other half of the Free Thinkers Society. So you're doing your arithmetic well. There are just 2 of them in that thing. Get this properly. And when Judge Driscoll dies later on, then we're going to do another novel and the conflict. Well, David Wilson unknowingly sets things in motion. He sees a mulatto woman with 2 children, infants. And again, we need to understand mulatto. We might think, oh, that's some a tawny skin. No, Roxana, usually called Roxy, is very white in her complexion because she is only 15/16 white and 1/16 black. But given the politics and sociology of the time, as Twain said, the 1/16 outvoted the 15/16. So at a glance, anyone would assume she's white, but unfortunately she speaks like a donkey. So she is trapped in that role. She's had a child, we find out later who the father was, about the same day her mistress, her owner, had a child. And the 2 are very much alike, almost indistinguishable, and David Wilson comments on that. And Roxy realizes at that point, I'm the only one in town who knows which is which. I don't want my blood son growing up to suffer as a slave. Not that slavery in Missouri is as cruel as it was in Louisiana. So she decides to switch the 2 boys. She plays God. And that will have severe consequences later on. Anyhow, we skip ahead fairly quickly. We're going to call him Tom. Her biological son is regarded as white. He goes off to Yale, doesn't learn a whole lot except how to be slick. And he's very fond of gambling, which gets him in trouble. He's forever in debt. And the other son, her biological son, Chambers, looks white as the other boy, but he speaks as a black and he accepts his role. Well, things would have been fine, but that debt problem has Tom needing money. And he sometimes slips around and steals. One time, in this matter of appearances and duplicity, David Wilson sees a woman in Judge Driscoll's home stealing, and then there's a report of a theft, but nobody saw a woman or can figure out who the woman is. Well, actually, it's Tom in disguise. But things become more complicated. Roxy's owner dies, and she is manumitted. She goes off and works on a riverboat for several years, works hard, saves money, and has enough to retire on, and then the bank fails. And in the 19th century, when a bank fails, there's no FDIC. Everybody's money is gone. So she's in financial trouble, comes back to town, finally reveals her identity to her biological son, who's not happy. But in her generosity, she says, I can solve your financial problem. You sell me back into slavery. But you sell me up the river. And he says, yes, Ma, I'll do it. And he arranges a transaction. She gets on the boat and looks around and notices the log is floating downriver with the boat. And she says, oh, log, sold down the river. And she's worked brutally for several months until she escapes and comes back and threatens him with exposure. And he needs money, and he is going to steal it from his uncle, his benefactor. The old gentleman is asleep at the time, and Tom goes in, gets the money. The old gentleman wakes up, grabs his son by the shoulder, and the son turns around and stabs him with a very expensive dagger and flees. The dagger is originally owned by two Italian twins who come to town. They were celebrities till one of them kicks Tom's butt, literally kicks Tom's butt out of the speaking area. And then the crime seems to be perfect. There is a corpse, a bloody dagger that's been described as missing, belonging to the Italians, and they've heard a noise, they ran in, and they're discovered next to the body. It seems pretty open and shut. But David Wilson has a strange habit of taking fingerprints and putting them on glass plates. He's done it for 20 years. He did it shortly after the two little babies were born, several weeks later, and then at the time of the death. And he's agreed to act as the attorney. It looks like he's going to lose the case until at night he starts looking at these slides. And lo and behold, he finds the owner of the prints that are found on the dagger. And in a fairly dramatic court scene, he finally shows that Tom is the one who stole the dagger, killed his uncle, and he's the culprit. And he's going to be sold, well, he's not going to be sold, he's convicted. And here's where Twain gets into that social criticism. We now know, thanks to fingerprints, first time in all American literature. We know who the culprit is. He's quickly convicted, sentenced to die. And then the locals start thinking it over. You know, it'll cost $500 for the state of Missouri to hang that rascal. We could do better than that. And they call the governor. He understands. He pardons Tom. He reverts to his true identity as a slave, chattel property, and he is sold down the river. The very fate that his mother thought she would avoid for him. So it's not a particularly well-crafted novel, and that's probably too hasty. Better move on to some other matters in here.
That was actually fair.
Someone who struggled through this book,
That was really good.
Well, it's not the best plotting, and if you read some criticism, you know, the scholars discussing among themselves, which you might say for when you have trouble sleeping. There's an argument as to whether Twain composed it on his own, or he had originally put it together with those extraordinary twins. I do not recommend those extraordinary twins. It's about real Siamese twins, joined physically, and he meant it to be funny about what happens if they want to marry, what happens if, well, one of them is a teetotaler, my kind of weirdo, and his twin loves to drink, and they have real problems trying to work that out. It's only if you're determined to read all of Twain, otherwise I'd skip that one. And there's some question as to whether he had these together and tore them apart. Yes?
He wrote several of his novels as serials in newspapers, magazines. Was this one of those or not?
No, it wasn't. Now, glad you mentioned that. A cereal is not like breakfast food. It's spelled S-E-R-I-L, that type of cereal. You might be astonished to know that when Dickens' novels in serial form came out, fans in America knew the day the ship was due at the dock. They were down there to meet it. And something else to think about as readers. All of us have learned to read silently to ourselves. If you go back in history, St. Augustine was astonished that Ambrose claimed to be reading, but Augustine heard nothing. Ambrose was one of the very first to learn to read silently. Now, I mention that because in the 19th century, there was no TV, no movies, and none of those cursed screen, well, my bias against computers got out there. People more often got together, sometimes to sing, sometimes to hear something. When Lincoln and Douglas debated, they debated for 3 hours. The audiences would listen carefully. About these serial novels, often at night, someone with a good dramatic reading voice, unlike mine, would sit there and read the novel aloud, 2 or 4 chapters, with 20, 30, 40 people listening glued. And they would gather next month and continue the novel. So they weren't just reading novels, they were hearing them as well, which is a little bit different. You know, the best-selling novel in America in the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin. It also came out in serial format like that. It makes for a real challenge for the author, because once the first 4 chapters are out, he can't go back and rework it. And we forget that now with our computers and delete features and all that. So it was a challenge. Okay, well, I've got notes here to keep myself from getting lost. Twain was speaking at a time of the Lyceums. I don't know if people still do Lyceums or not. Happily, I was the Lyceum director at the Mexico Military Institute. Brought in Cal Thomas, Harrison Schmidt, an astronaut, Hal Moore, who wrote We Were Soldiers, young. We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Anyway, audiences again in the 19th century loved to have something to do. The Lyceum initially was about education. Some learned scholar would go forth on theology, philosophy, well, did a great job. And people liked it for a long time. But Twain came along about the time of Artemis Ward and other humorists. And audiences' tastes gradually shifted, for better or worse, from education, which I grew, to humor. They liked to laugh. And if we had the time, and occasionally we might ask what's happened with humor in American life now, what happened to the comics, and why are we still listening to them. But Twain hit it at the right time. Artemis Ward preceded him. He wrote prolifically and spoke as a humorist, had great success, and died at 33 from exhaustion. Twain entered into that, and he observed to others that his competition did not survive because they were merely humorists. Humorists of the mere sort cannot survive. He also said, humor must not professedly teach, and it must professedly preach, but it must do both if it is to live forever. So on the witticisms that Joe put up there, if you go online, you can find 30 to 100 of them, and many of them work quite well. They seem funny, but Twain also said, I have always preached. That is the reason I've lasted for 30 years. So he wasn't being just merely funny, ha-ha. He was showing us something about human nature. Now, sometimes the humor was very gentle. He observed a strange thing when he was in Washington, D.C. I saw a congressman with both hands in his own pockets. So that hasn't changed so much. Also, he had jokes about safe sex. When McAvoy Lane, a Mark Twain humorist of lower quality than Hal Holbrook, came to speak at NIMI, another of the fellows I brought in as Lyceum director, he riveted the cadets' attention. He said, now you folks think we didn't know about sex back there that time, but we did. We were fond of it, in fact. We practiced safe sex. Anytime a guy and a gal jumped a haystack, and neither one of them lit on a pitchfork, it was safe sex. So he did that. Now, one that I found quite caustic. Do you remember Lady Astor and Winston Churchill? The two of them despised each other. She said, if Mr. Churchill, if you were my husband, I would poison your tea. If I were your husband, I assure you, I would gladly drink it. Now, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, perhaps a name you'll recognize, a novelist from the 19th century editor, had a wife, and Twain despised that woman. He said, a strange and vanity-devoured, detestable woman. I do not believe I could ever learn to like her, except on a raft at sea with no other provisions in sight. Well, now Sam Clemens chose his pen name a month after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. That came out in September of 1862. So that proclamation, his name change came in October. And Joe's told you something about the origins of it. Another possible guess, which fits Twain's taste, is that Mark Twain means two whiskeys on the bar. But more than likely, it's has to do with the same water. Okay, this was written during a dark period in Mark Twain's life. It was his last complete novel. Now, he did write other things called novels that were published after his death, but that's the dark period that Joe referred to. And unless you really have a passion for Twain, I don't recommend them. They're bitter and fault-finding. But again, by that time, he'd lost a son and 2 daughters and a wife. He'd been through bankruptcy twice. And frankly, he was tired of being a funny man. Anyway, this novel is the third of our visits to Hannibal. The first one is Tom Sawyer. It presents an idyllic life, slow, safe, a little danger. Injun Joe is out there, and Muff Potter digging up graves. But it's a boy's book. It's idyllic. It appeals to our nostalgia, if that's only the type of life we could have as kids. Huck Finn might be mistaken for a boy's book by younger readers or a casual first reader. If there is a great American novel, or the 5 great American novels, I would easily put it on that list. It's a masterpiece because the narration is brilliant. We have a 14-year-old semi-literate hip boy whom we like and trust and want to turn out well. And through ironic distance, what he observes confuses him, but we see the point very clearly. And that's something new in American literature, that a 14-year-old boy can hold our attention in that fashion. As he descends the river, revealing, we see hypocrisy and perversity. 2 families fade feudly, Grangersons and Shepherdsons. You catch the names Granger, Green, and Shepherdsons. They're having a romantic feud, much like Sir Walter Scott's novels. He makes fun of that. Colonel Sherburne is a tough local fellow who rather casually shoots down Boggs, the town drunk. Now Boggs is just loud. He's not mean. He's not troublesome. Just disagreeable. Sherburne had warned him, don't come to town drunk again, or I'll shoot you dead. And that's exactly what happened. Boggs comes roaring into town. Sherburne pulls out his shotgun and drops him dead. That night, the townspeople come in, threatening him. He stands on his porch with a shotgun and dares you dogs to come do something about it. You're brave only in the dark, not in the light. And the crowd melts away. So it's a set up on the rough, tough cowboy image of the period. He ridicules the religious revivals and camp meetings. He also ridicules the hucksters, the Duke and the Dauphin, as they play games on town. And the further we go down in that novel, the more hypocrisy, the more the dirty side of the South we see, and it worked well. Now, he was stuck on it. He got to chapter 17 and didn't know what to do with the novel. It was set aside for 3 years. The problem is that Jim and Crocker floating down the river. If they get below St. Louis, it's very much slave country. The further south, the more dangerous, the more degrading. And the simplest thing for Jim to do is simply wait till dark and get off on the Illinois side of the river and scoot away. But Twain can't then go after the south if that happens, so there's a fog, and the raft goes past St. Louis in the fog, and then he's able to finish it up. Well, that's probably what you want to know about Finn, except one of the key moments in American literature is when Huck is torn with his conscience. Is he going to be a good citizen? Maybe a good Christian, not so much on that. A good citizen. He's supposed to turn in that runaway slave. He's seen the handbill. And in his semi-literate fashion, he writes a letter explaining who Jim is, and he's run away. And he thinks about the times Jim sat up all night watching on the raft, looking out for him, fixing meals, being his friend. And he finally decides he can't do it. And he says, all right then, as he tears it up, I'll go to hell. It's not a flippant, casual remark as we might address people we don't like. He thinks he's forfeited his salvation, but his friend matters more. When we get to the end of the novel, Huck has seen enough of civilization, always misspelled in the novel. I've seen enough of civilization, and I resolved to light out new territory. And that's his judgment on it. So in this novel, we're coming back to Hannibal for the third time. And this time it's called Dawson's Landing, and it's below St. Louis. Basically the Hannibal of his youth that's been relocated. Slavery is not a problem for whites, it's just in the air. That's the way things are. We see it very differently, as we should. But in this novel, there's a quiet rebuke. We find out that one of the fellows is going to turn out bad anyway, whether he's black or white. He's going to turn out rotten, and that's Tom. Nobody ends up particularly well, which might just take us to another question. Some copies of the book, this one says Puddin'head Wilson, and as does the other one, and some other copies say the tragedy of Puddin'head Wilson. Have you figured out what the tragedy is?
Nothing changes.
Yes, nothing changes. It could be tragic. But see, usually in literature, if it's tragic, there's a character of high estate who falls to a character flaw, usually pride. Who is it in this novel? There isn't one. David Wilson's a nice guy, dependable, level-headed, and finally has brilliance to solve the murder. But it's not his tragedy. He ends up wealthy, respected, and successful. The two boys who were switched have tragic outcomes. I don't know if you thought about it or not, but Chambers, who finally discovers he's white, still speaks like a darky. He's no longer welcome among the blacks, and he don't know how to talk among whites. Now, Twain drops it. We don't know, but apparently he's going to have a miserable existence. If there's a character we care about, it's probably Roxy.
Yeah.
But she creates her own misery. She'd been better off leaving the twins alone. So it's a little bit of a stretch to call it the tragedy of Puddin'head Wilson. Certainly not the character Puddin'head.
Yeah.
But you see, this is a shifting point in Twain's career. If you're expecting a ha-ha, this is a funny enough book, there's not too much of that. Now, the exceptions might be with some of those captions in the calendar. Just to do those quickly, in chapter 13, when I reflect upon the number of disagreeable people who I know who've gone to a better world, I'm moved to lead a different life. In chapter 15, nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. In chapter 19, I think maybe Joe's had it, few things are hard to put up with than the annoyance of a good example. And then we get to the last chapter, not numbered, called Conclusion. There are two of them. It is often the case that the man who can't tell a lie thinks he is the best judge of one. And then this other one reminds me of closing Huck Finn. October 12th, the discovery, if you think about Columbus Day. It was wonderful to find America, but it would have been more wonderful to miss it. So, again, do you see some of the complexity with Twain? Yes, he was known as a funny man, and he was a master on stage. I don't believe he was ever ill-prepared for an appearance. It's too late now because Hal Holbrook has died, but Hal Holbrook memorized 14 hours of Twain material. And anytime he walked on stage, he wasn't sure at the moment which parts of the 14 hours he'd deliver. Now, there is a DVD version called Mark Twain Tonight, and except for Jim Blaine's note, most of it is very funny. It might be worth your time to look at. But I wish that Holbrook had done more of that on tape. It was marvelous. Second time I saw him was in Albuquerque, and I was sitting 5 rows from the stage and got to see him up front, up close. Well, he lived in the time of the Gilded Age. Remember his first novel, written in conjunction with Charles Dudley Warner, he vowed never to do that again, is called The Gilded Age. Think about the term gilded. What does it mean?
Means something that's covered with gold, but it's not gold all the way through. It's kind of rotten on the inside.
Appearances are deceiving, indeed. What looks to be golden on more careful investigation is not. And that sums up much of Twain's views of America. And again, you can see how he's having trouble being content. He grew up poor in Missouri. When he finally achieves a little literary fame, where does he settle? Hartford, Connecticut. Who are his neighbors? Harriet Beecher Stowe, James Russell Lowell, Emerson, Hawthorne. He was smack dab in the middle of America's leading literary figures. And that's where he wanted to live. And again, for some of us to think through it economically, he's a poor boy, just barely starting to make his way, and he falls in love with Livy, a very wealthy gal. And when his father-in-law gives him a house worth about $43,000, which is big bucks in those times, it comes with 6 servants. That's a lot of expenses to have to cover. So he was always worried about making money, and he had very poor judgment on the finances. Joe, I read that the Page typesetter had 18,000 moving parts.
18,000.
So I guess you would, I got Claus' attention. I guess the spacecraft had more than 18,000, but 18,000 mechanical pieces is a problem.
It took $24 billion to make it work.
So poor judgment financially, but he went out and spoke on the speaking tour and recovered his money. But again, as he aged, less funny, a little more bitter, and there's other history of the country perhaps. Youthful optimism, and moving towards age, and discomfort could be. Well, I think that's covered quite a bit. Let's see here. Well, we might look at connection to some of Twain's other works. Tom Sawyer is definitely a boy's book, playful, innocent, nostalgic. Huck Finn is more morally complex, but it is one of the really great novels in American life. Life on the Mississippi is Twain's recollections becoming a pilot. And I recommend that book to you. Incidentally, if you still have a VHS player, I heard someone laugh, I'm probably the only one who does. You can get it Life on the Mississippi, The Innocents Abroad, and some other 90-minute versions done by Nebraska Public Television of these novels. Oddly, the only one that's been translated to DVD is Puddin'head Wilson, which is a so-so summary of the novel. In The Innocents Abroad, Mark Twain lampoons crude Americans encountering the Middle East and European civilizations. He has a lot of fun doing that, particularly in Paris. He said he'd heard the ladies actually kicked their legs high in the air on stage. And he thought he should investigate, but when he got there, he was kind of embarrassed by the whole matter, and he covered his eyes, but I peeked. And in saying something like that, he shows a lot about human nature. You know, we like to think we're good, but given a chance to temptation, we're likely to go that direction. In Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, American pragmatism triumphs over medieval England when Hank Morgan is transported back in time to improve that area. Okay, well, I think that's pretty much it, except the quotations from the novel. One that he notes about Roxy is that by fiction created by herself, he, meaning Tom, became her master. And that was a cruel irony. And then, if you haven't read it, Roxy can become very angry at times. She's really angry at Tom. What could you do? You could be Judas to your own mother to save your own worthless hide. Would anybody believe it? No, a dog couldn't. He was the low-downest, orneriest hound that was ever pupped in this world, and I was responsible for it. And she spat on him. Now, the heading for that chapter 18 is gratitude and treachery are merely the two extremities of the same procession. And then the last line in the novel is, as soon as the governor understood the case, he pardoned Tom at once, and the creditors sold him down the river. Okay, well, that's a kind of a hasty run-through. What questions do you have for Joe and Drew? Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the things that when I was reading it, I found myself wanting to see what was happening to the real Tom who became Chambers.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
you got a little bit of that. Occasionally they'd make a couple of comments about him. But I missed that part of it. I wanted to see what was happening to him, and I'm sorry he didn't include very much of that. He pretty much centered it on Chambers, who actually, became Tom.
Well, I agree with that. He's writing financial pressure. Got to make money, got to finish this thing up. He struggled with it, and there's some obvious flaws. And another novelist might have pursued what happens to Tom. I think it would make an interesting novel to have pursued him for the next 20 years after he gets his new identity, his true identity.
That's season 2.
Yes, ma'am.
I thought it was interesting, the same type of theme as Prince and the Pauper.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of doubling. I skipped that in the notes. Prince and Pauper has doubling. The two boys think it's fun, and briefly the prince thinks it's nice to see the rough side of life after he's been beaten, he wants out.
Yeah.
And the pauper likes the royal life so well, he's not really ready to leave. But there's also some doubling goes on in wretched, extraordinary twins. If you think about the close of Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer arrives on the scene and said, "Oh, Huck, you be me."
Mm-hmm.
And there's some doubling going on there. And again, the name Mark, something really important, Twain, duality.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yes.
It's interesting that you said that he was writing because he needed money. Because reading this book, I get the impression he didn't want to, and he wasn't very. It's not his best book, of course, but it is his most Mark Twain book because he's the king of rabbit trails. And the book, if you took all the rabbit trails out of this book, you'd have 3 pages of plot. So he obviously didn't really get into the plot. He's everywhere, and it's interesting and it's good writing, but there's not. It's 10% story. Yeah.
No.
Well, it just seems like he was also, he was speaking about human nature, and I was reading it thinking nature versus nurture. I mean, twins get separate, or they weren't twins, but the two boys get exchanged, and then they grow up the way our society allowed them to grow up, and it, you know, what's to happen to Chambers now that he's, I get them confused, but the original, the wealthy man's son, who then had to become a slave, well, that's all he knew, and it's, you know, I think it speaks to this time period as well, of what our expectations are for people in our own society. Another, I had a question though, about Huck Finn, and I remember my teacher reading it to us in junior high, and we could hardly wait to hear it. I was thinking about that as you were talking about the readers, but also nowadays, isn't Huck Finn on the banned book list? And why is it?
Some schools have banned it.
And why? What is it about that's?
Because
The vernacular of
Okay.
Digger and.
Yeah, but he wrote in
Right.
the language.
Well, that's all the more reason why they shouldn't be banned, right?
Now, if you don't be disturbed by things like that, there's one line in the novel where Rox gets raging about the blood sons, the dog. It's the black blood he killed. 1/16 is causing the trouble, according to the mulatto mother. That's a sobering statement.
Well, you know,
She's been taught that for a long time, she believes it.
I was taken, you mentioned Roxy's temper, the fact that she was very angry. Another passage where she got very angry that kind of struck me was when he told her that he refused to duel with the twin who kicked her and knocked her off the stage. And she took the position of an upper class person whose honor was violated, and she was very angry with him, in spite of the fact that he probably didn't want to get shot. She was very, very angry with him, took the position of maybe his white father would have taken. And I thought that was very interesting, somewhat inconsistent.
Yeah, I'm very disappointed in this matter of banning books. Let it stand and fall on its own merits. And if we're going to understand people, we begin with where they were and what they say about themselves. After that, we can start making some judgments, but to say ahead of time, I ain't going to listen, it's not fair.
Well, I think as most of us being here in the library, we're very appreciative of books.
Right.
So I think we would probably all agree.
I heard it on the internet that said to all the kids that are in school now, once you hear that a book is banned, go out and find it and read it.
Yes.
It's the most important thing you can do for yourself.
I will put a plug in that we did, well, I'm not speaking out of place here, but we did purchase a recent book that was, that caused a bunch of stink. The mouse book that, Tennessee took it out of schools. And so we purchased it. We did not put a book plate in it because I didn't want anyone to receive any, you know, rebuttal from anyone here at Robson. But it's, you know, it's interesting. I think we do need to be able to read books.
Absolutely.
Especially banned books.
Right.
And no, is it worthy to be banned? And I was surprised, because I remember at junior high, this teacher reading it, and we hung on to her words like it was, you know, like we go to movies these days.
Right.
We were just enthralled by listening to this story being woven. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Is there any truth to that whole Haley's Comet thing with
But he came in with a.
that he came in and went out with a comet?
He did make the jest that I came in with Haley's Comet and I will go out. And he did. Time of the day, 1835, 1910.
The comet came on the night he was born, and the comet came by again the night he died.
I'm not sure about.
That's the way
It's
it's.
the year.
It's a year.
Yeah, but they, you know, they made more romantic.
Well, Jefferson and John Adams died on the 4th of July,
Yeah.
1825, 26.
Any other questions for Joe or for Lewis? Well, speaking on behalf of the friends of the library, but also for all the people here, I want to thank both of you for giving your time and your expertise to share with us, because I learned a lot, and I was reading the body language out there. So thanks very much.
Thank you.